Once innovative approaches and technologies are born, they have to find their way into the marketplace and into the minds of policymakers, and that's not easy. It means forging partnerships with government leaders and business leaders, and that's something we do at the Energy Initiative, and something our keynote speaker this morning has done throughout his career over and over again. In his 29 years as its leader, Fred Krupp has helped to grow the Environmental Defense Fund from a small nonprofit to a recognized world leader in the environmental movement. In that time, Fred has worked closely with the governments and businesses and communities across America and has harnessed market forces for environmental ends, always focused on smart, practical, and strategic solutions. His work with FedEx, McDonald's, and Walmart, among others, has resulted in the development of hybrid electric mid-sized trucks, the elimination of millions of pounds of packaging waste, and the improvement of energy efficiency across the global retail supply chain. An influential leader on climate and energy, Fred helped launch the corporate nonprofit Climate Coalition, the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, and is a co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Earth the Sequel, The Race to Reinvent Energy and Stop Global Warming. It's my great honor to welcome Fred Krupp this morning. We'll have a 20-minute Q&A when he finishes, so please hold your questions. But Fred, welcome.
Thanks, Rob. You know, climate change, we know what to do. We know the science, we know the economics, we even know the policies that will transform our world's energy system from fossil fuels to clean energy. What we must do now is summon the political will to act. Congress is not now poised to pass either a carbon tax or a cap-and-trade system. And international negotiations have moved at the pace of, well, international negotiations. Broad national and global solutions are absolutely necessary, but they're not likely to happen next week or, sadly, next year. That means as we work toward these larger objectives, we must seize every opportunity to cut emissions now. The arc of the moral universe may bend toward justice, but the line on the graph of global emissions won't bend until we make it do so. That means EPA adopting strong national limits on carbon pollution from power plants, America's largest source of emissions. That means reducing methane leakage from our natural gas supply chain. Methane is 86 times more powerful over the first 20 years as a climate forcer than carbon dioxide. And that means reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the countries that produce the most. Which brings me to my subject today, a tale of two countries. The United States and China are different in history and culture and in current circumstances, but they are joined together by the fact that they are the two biggest engines on the planet of production and consumption. They're the first and second in the world in carbon emissions, using 40% of the world's energy, producing 40% of the world's carbon emissions, and burning 60% of the world's coal. One is a wealthy nation struggling with political division and geographical differences. The other is a growing economic power struggling with the twin challenges of lifting people out of large-scale poverty and solving a deepening environmental crisis. So today I want to talk about the current status of climate action in these two nations, including some hopeful movements in both places, and what we should be watching for to judge the success, and what we can all be doing to help nurture and accelerate the progress, because it will require our collective intelligence to make this come out all right. And that's why the MIT Climate CoLab is so important. We need to harness the wisdom of crowds. Now, the advice columnists will tell you that whenever you're looking at a relationship, it's good to start with your own issues. So I'm going to begin with the United States. For more than a decade now, our country has been too distracted, too politicized, and just plain too slow to deal with climate change. All the while, we've continued to pour pollution into the atmosphere without any real plan for altering our dangerous behavior. But things have begun to change. The first piece of good news is that emissions are down. Emissions from the energy sector in the United States have dropped 12% since 2007. Now, of course, these reductions weren't the result of deliberate policy, and they hardly guarantee future reductions. But nevertheless, they are a welcome shift. The drop in pollution is due to several factors: a boom in natural gas production, which has replaced some coal being used by electric utilities, a byproduct of the regulations on conventional air pollutants that have been adopted by EPA, improved energy efficiency, and of course, the unwelcome economic slowdown since the crash of 2008. Of these, energy efficiency and the standards on conventional pollution will continue to produce some benefits. But natural gas, even if it's done right, is still a fossil fuel. The ultimate solution to our climate problem is efficient use of zero carbon energy. And because we can't count on these reductions continuing as though they're on autopilot, it's even more important that we are seeing the first glimmers of positive political news in the United States. Now, I don't want to overstate the progress. Congress is still gridlocked over anything having to do with climate change. In fact, over anything having to do with anything. But the public and the president increasingly get it. In the last 4 years, there's been a 12 percentage point rise in the number of Americans who say there is solid evidence that global warming exists. And it's not just in the blue states. My own organization, EDF, has just finished a poll in greater Sioux City, South Dakota. And the results were that 71% responded that climate change is a reality today. The fact is, whatever the pundits and the blogs and the partisan media say, people will trust their own observations. And the evidence is all around us, from droughts and wildfires to superstorms and searing heat. And President Obama has laid out an aggressive climate action plan using his executive authority to improve energy efficiency and cut pollution. On top of the administration's earlier good work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from cars, and also the large stimulus investment in clean energy, the EPA is now committed to going forward with standards on greenhouse gas pollution from both new and existing power plants. I'm confident that these rules will be both ambitious and flexible, limiting emissions while promoting energy efficiency, and doing all this at the lowest cost. But more, much more needs to be done before we will have fulfilled our responsibilities to future generations. We must guarantee reductions in carbon pollution by setting declining limits on what can be poured into the sky. We must make sure the price of all energy sources accounts for the costs that those sources are imposing on society. That will drive innovation, investment, and entrepreneurship. And that will show the world that the United States has the political will to act on this issue. Frankly, right now, one of the main obstacles to an international treaty on climate change is doubt that the United States Senate will ratify a climate change treaty. But reducing our fossil fuel use in America is not all that we can do. We must ensure that the methane escaping from our natural gas system doesn't accelerate climate change, and that's why EDF has joined with top universities and researchers around the country to sponsor a series of studies to measure how much methane is seeping from our natural gas system into the atmosphere. We're also, by the way, measuring natural gas in America's cities, leaks from our distribution systems. We've outfitted a car with a methane sensor, and our aim is to produce publicly available maps of leak rates of natural gas so as to arm citizen scientists with information to help them solve problems in their neighborhoods. And we're also focused on the development of smart power. Imagine a world where homes not only run on clean electricity, but they also generate, store, and sell it. A world where power companies get paid for conserving electricity, not just generating it. Where, when supplies are tight, customers get paid if they exercise the option to move their demand to some other time when renewable energy is available. Yes, electric utilities in our country and around the world are at a crossroads. They can replace old, dirty power plants with either more of the same, or they can make the turn to clean energy and transforming the energy sector as dramatically as we've transformed the communication sector. Now, EDF is working in the 9 states in our country that use almost half of the electricity in our country. In Texas, we're part of the Pecan Street Project, which is a neighborhood lab of residential homes that are generating, storing, and selling electricity. In California, in Texas, and Illinois, we're taking on outdated utility rules that limit payments to businesses and homeowners for how much solar energy that they can stream into the grid. Under current rules, you see, in many states, homeowners and businesses face limits on how much can be sold back into the grid. By breaking down these regulatory barriers, we remove critical obstacles in the way of clean energy. And we can't stop until we've modernized the United States' electric grid. Our power grid hasn't been updated since Thomas Edison invented it. It's time for smart power. All this taken together will reduce pollution as we work to achieve comprehensive national action. Now, the other piece of this equation is across the Pacific, that growing, restless, powerful nation that has become such an important player in any international question. As with everything about China these days, the numbers are impressive and intimidating. They burn half the world's coal. Their need for energy is expected to double again by 2020. 250 million rural residents will move to cities in the next 15 years, and 300 million will buy cars over the same time period. China, with its 1.3 billion people, now produces more carbon emissions than the United States. Far lower on a per capita basis, I should add, but 50% more in total. In short, this problem does not get solved without Chinese action. The good news is that the government of China recognizes that things must change. Their cities today are shrouded in pollution from fossil fuels, undermining the quality of life and health for China's citizens, shortening the lives of 1 million people a year. In a nation that prizes political stability, unhappiness with air pollution has become a prime motivator for action. Indeed, social media and crowdsourced air pollution measurements have helped drive the urgent need for action. Citizen scientists even flew kites to take pollution readings, and the US Embassy posted its own measurements on the web. China has the ability to move aggressively on this issue, and there's no time to lose. Their next 5-year plan will be finalized in the next 2 years and will either lock in emissions or improvements for decades. Of course, cutting pollution always faces the perceived trade-off with economic growth and creating new jobs, a critical challenge in a nation where 7% economic growth is viewed as the minimum necessary to absorb all the new entrants into the workforce. So what needs to be done? I would point to 4 major areas for action. First, China must accelerate the adoption of renewable energy. It's currently 8% of their nation's energy supply, but that's not enough to match their economic growth or to replace coal. Second, China has the world's largest supply of technically recoverable shale gas. If they can overcome some of the obstacles to exploiting that resource, substitution of gas for coal could dramatically bring emissions down, but only if it's done right, without methane leakage. Because if we have massive leakage, it will only exacerbate the problem. Third, China must increase energy efficiency. Leading Chinese industries are already paying attention to this, and American companies like Walmart are encouraging them to do more as they purchase from the factories in China. And fourth, and perhaps most importantly, China must build the institutions and legal infrastructure to handle both clean air and climate enforcement. Now, we haven't figured this out completely in the United States either, though here we do have great tools like the Clean Air Act and the experience of EPA that gives us some mechanisms for action. And just as in the United States, we balance the needs of cities and states, China must develop its own approach to these jurisdictional issues. Now, what is less well known is that China is taking steps to achieve many of these goals. EDF's Beijing office is working closely with government officials as they try to move the nation forward. China is looking to models and best practices like the EU, California, and RGGI, of which Massachusetts is part, and the national programs like the New Zealand program. China has established 7 pilot cap-and-trade programs covering almost a third of their economy, testing different approaches to see what will work best in China. EDF helps Shenzhen one pilot area, reach an agreement with California so that Chinese officials can learn from California's very successful Global Warming Solutions Act. In addition, the Chinese are pursuing 42 low-carbon development projects, linking prosperity for rural farmers with climate action through EDF's carbon farming efforts. And 1/3 of all solar installed in the world last year was installed in China. Several near-term milestones will let us know if China is on the path to restraining carbon emissions. Are they making progress toward the targets they established in their current 5-year plan? They've just announced a cap on coal consumption, but that cap is above current levels of coal burning, so we don't know yet whether it will be enforced. And just as important, we should look for policy announcements from the new administration, especially in the area of pricing of energy. In the end, the problem must be solved on both sides of the Pacific. The United States must learn to consume less wastefully, and China, with its growing consumer demand, must do so as well. Both nations need to produce using less energy and less pollution. Cleaning up the massive economic engines of these two countries and the supply chain that connects them is critical to global progress. As different as our political systems are, China is following the same path as all industrial nations have followed since the British began burning massive amounts of coal in the 19th century. Indeed, the air today in Wuhan is not so much different than the air in Pittsburgh or Manchester was in 1950. And given time, China would resolve its pollution issues as earlier developing nations have. But the unfortunate fact is we don't have time to wait for the natural economic evolution because China is rapidly developing at a moment when the science of climate change is urgent. It's certainly not fair that because of 2 centuries of pollution from Europe and the United States, China must shift more rapidly. But fair or not, that is the reality. And our obligation in the West is to lead by example, assist where needed, and cooperate to see that China and other developing nations can change quickly enough. The most important thing we can do to encourage Chinese action is to take serious climate action ourselves. The toughest question we face in China is Americans are smart. If climate change is so serious, why aren't you serious about tackling it? We've begun to answer that, but it will take sustained and concerted action before the United States can convincingly call for fundamental changes from Beijing. The more ambitious we are at home at the federal and state levels, in the White House and in Congress, the more we can expect from them. As I said at the outset, we know how to make real progress on climate change. What we must create is the political will to achieve it. And creating that will requires all of us to engage. It can't be a top-down process. We all have a role to play in helping Americans understand that China, with all its challenges, is moving forward. And to demonstrate to leaders in China that the hopeful signs from America are the beginnings of a real transformation. And in showing the skeptical and scared in both nations that a prosperous, clean, and safe future is possible if we have the will to grasp it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we have time for about 5 to 7 minutes of questions, so You can just manage your own questions
All
if you'd
right.
like. And if you could please step to the microphones to ask your questions so everyone can hear us and it can be heard on the web as well.
Morning.
Morning.
At the beginning of your talk, you presented some encouraging information, but I'm not sure it's correct, and I wouldn't have brought it up had I not heard this on the NPR coming in this morning. CO2 levels are up this year, increase from last year of 1.1%. That's a decrease from the rate of increase of 2.9% over the last decade, so encouraging in that respect. But I think it's evidence that things aren't progressing quite as well as we'd like, and I applaud your work in detecting, in measuring, quantifying methane emissions. I think that's potentially stands to erase all of the progress we might make on CO2. So keep it up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think the amount that we've come down since 2007 is significant, but I guess I predicted the morning NPR story by saying that it's not a guaranteed trend line, and so thanks for the update, and thanks for the comment about the methane work.
Hi. I'm shocked by the lack of coverage of the climate issue by the mainstream media. It's almost, to me, a conspiracy. I mean, I read the New York Times, and they dabble occasionally with it. But I would hope that somebody has the influence who knows people at MSNBC, like Rachel Maddow and people like that. I mean, they get so excited about things that are much less important than climate change. And I've tweeted to her and tried to contact her and say, Rachel, say something about climate change. So if anybody knows her or anybody else on MSNBC, Lawrence O'Donnell, all these people, I mean, nothing is, when climate change goes bad, all of this other politics is minutia.
Thank you, and you're lucky today. You have on the Environmental Defense Fund team, Eric Pooley leading one of the panels that used to be the editor of Fortune magazine, so the media coverage is an important issue. Yes, sir.
A comment on the last comment. Justin Gillis, who was the climate change reporter at the New York Times, spoke here, I believe, last year to the Knight Fellows, science journalists, and he was about to embark on a long-term series on climate solutions after having finished a series on climate change science. And about a month or two later, the New York Times announced that they were getting rid of their environmental desk. So that's one interesting thing. I congratulate you on talking about methane management, but I would suggest that you not talk about methane as a fossil fuel, because we all produce methane. We're going to have to manage methane, even if we don't mine methane fossil fuels. Methane management is important to think about. I would also suggest that you talk to Joy Ito here at the Media Lab, who's been involved in SafeCast, which is the citizens monitoring group that's been doing radiation monitoring in Japan. But they also have been developing new tools for citizen science around methane and other things. And I'm sure you know Nathan Phillips over at BU, who's done the work in Boston with looking at the infrastructure. We really need to have that kind of stuff. We really need to have citizen science do this kind of thing. We need to have it through the schools, having the high school students do it and kick their elders' asses, our asses, to get this stuff going. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. We have been working with Nathan Phillips, and I will take your advice, and we will be in contact if my team hasn't already with Joyce. I believe transparency in who's emitting what and where it's coming from is one of the great assets we have to work with as we try to drive emissions down to safe levels.
Good morning. Thank you for your sort of tour d'horizon of climate dynamics between US and China. And 2015 is a watershed moment in the climate international negotiations trying to form a new agreement. And I think you rightly argued, fair or not, China is an essential part, but will rightly follow if it sees convincing role models and presentations. And from the West, and particularly from the US. So what concrete, probably 2 or 3 trigger points, indicators for US action between now and 2015 do you see which will be politically a stretch but feasible and which would be sufficient to persuade the rest of the world that this country takes the topic seriously and is basically willing to move? And I think a linked question, what's your view on the role of these international global agreements, treaties, I think you called it, and compared to cutting a bilateral deal between the two largest emitters? Thank you. My name is Conrad Ritter. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a great question. Let me try to give a concise answer. First, I think demonstrating U.S. political will in the next couple of years is going to be hard. There's only so much that can happen in a couple of years. But one, the EPA coming out with strong standards on power plants, new and existing power plants. Two, I think we can begin to see state-level public utility commissions reforming rules to clear away the thicket of obstacles in the path of clean energy really taking off as distributed energy sources. And three, our nation can get serious about methane emissions, which are not just from the natural gas industry, but come from landfills and cows and a lot of other sources. But at least we can tackle the biggest source of those emissions in the United States, which is the oil and gas industry. These short-lived gases emitted today will account for about 40% of the climate forcing we'll see in the next 20 years. We absolutely have to continue an all-out assault on CO2, but it's time to get serious about methane and these gases that are ruining our world right now. Yeah.
I've two questions on China. Number one is the elephant in the room, right? How do you measure GDP? Because there are some accounts that say that if you take into account the health effects of air pollution and reduced productivity, then China hasn't grown at all in the last 5 years. So is there a debate among the policy circles within China about how to account for GDP? And number two, China's recent efforts at reducing air pollution of particulates and sulfur and mercury don't necessarily lead to reduction in CO2 because they're also encouraging things like coal gasification and coal to liquids. So your views on sort of decoupling the climate issue with the air pollution issue in China?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say that there is a robust debate in the Chinese academic community about these issues, including the definition of growth. And the Chinese government is very, very aware of the health costs that they've been seeing on the eastern seaboard recently. Second of all, I think you're right that there's not a complete overlap of things that clean up local air pollution and things that clean up climate. But when you take into account the fact that we need to clean the air today, and we are going to need to clean the carbon emissions out for the world's climate to be safe, then it turns out that the calculus is it just makes sense to go clean now. And that's the calculus that I think increasingly the Chinese government is more and more aware of. Thank you.